Hi, and welcome to the first session of our virtual training series on the 7 core issues in adoption and permanency. My name is Michaela, and I work in the APSS program at Children's Bureau. We are absolutely thrilled to have with us today the authors themselves of the 7 core issues book. If you haven't already read this book, I highly recommend it. Just check it out. There's a wealth of information in here, and we'll be discussing some of it today, but if you want to know more, this is definitely the place to start. So with that, I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing our presenters. First, we have Allison Davis Maxon, who's a nationally recognized expert in the field of child welfare and children's mental health. She specializes in attachment, developmental trauma, and permanency in adoption. She's also the executive director of the National Center on Adoption and Permanency, and was the foster care consultant for the Paramount movie Instant Family. Our other presenter today is Sharon Roszia. She's an internationally known educator, presenter, and author who's devoted her career to the institution of foster care, adoption, and relative care. She's also a consultant at the National Center on Adoption and Permanency and was the developer of the 7 core issues in 1988. Overall, she has well over 50 years of adoption clinical practice in the field of child welfare. So again, thank you both for being with us today. I know you have a wealth of information and you have so much to cover, so I'll go ahead and pass it over to you now. Thank you.
By looking through their particular lens and looking at the core issues, as for instance, Dr. Michael Grand in Canada looked at it through the lens of step parent adoptions. That's not something we've often talked about. Chris Probasco has looked at it through third-party reproduction. So the book is just filled with wonderful material, and you'll get a chance to meet in the 4th session Lynn White Dixon, who's one of the contributors to the book, and we'll be looking together at transracial and multiracial adoption, foster care, and relative caregiving. So when we talk about the 7 core issues of adoption and permanency, we're looking at the experience of adoption for the constellation, which creates lifelong intergenerational issues and complexities. Lifelong, intergenerational. So our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our children, our grandchildren are all going to be impacted by the decisions that we make, either as the primary folks involved or as the professionals who touch those families. I want to bring you up to speed that we do use the word constellation throughout our presentation and throughout the book. Constellation was developed by Dr. Michael Grand in Canada, and it stands for all of us touched by the institutions of adoption, foster care, and relative caregiving. Professionals, extended family, and those very close in, which we're going to talk about briefly this morning. So we are all members of the constellation of adoption. We're all in this boat together. And the goal of the 7 core issues in adoption and permanency is to provide a roadmap that depathologizes the complexities that all of us confront as we move through our traumatic losses, our breaks in attachment, and it's to help us to promote understanding and healing. All of our reactions, all the core issues, are normal reactions to abnormal situations. They're all normal reactions to abnormal situations. And we want people to have a really good opportunity to see their reactions as normal, not as pathologies, not as mental health issues. This is the old triangle of adoption that many of us who came in many years ago would be familiar with. And that said that the child, the adoptive parents, and the birth parents were the most important people, the only real people we looked at in those days. And we called us the triad. We were members of the triad. And what we're going to be doing is remembering that the history of child welfare and adoption is anchored in secrecy and shame. We didn't talk about these issues, and it wasn't okay to have not raised your children. And adoptive parents and birth first parents, which is how we refer to them today, adoptive and birth first parents didn't know each other. In fact, when I came into the field in 1963, which is probably older than most of you are who are watching, in 1963, we had several waiting rooms for people who were considering placing their children voluntarily for adoption, prospective adoptive parents, foster parents who were told not to attach to the children. And in fact, we changed them frequently so they wouldn't attach, and the child. And so it's real important to look at those changes, and changes include language. Language intones intent, feeling, inclusiveness, exclusiveness, and language is something that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as we work through the core issues with you. So as I said, we now call birth parents also first parents. They were the first parents. They will always be the first parents. Whether they carried the child and delivered and separated in the hospital, or they tried to parent that child for a period of time, they are the first parents. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And they really are not relinquishing parents until they have relinquished their children. They are parents for as long as they have the legal connection to their children. Adoptive parents today are called resource parents. They're kinship family members. They may be foster to adopt, and they may be adoptive parents. They may adopt internationally. They may adopt newborns. They may adopt a sibling set. They are all kinds of individual folks. And children today include infants, toddlers, teenagers that are adopted, and of course, they become adults. So our language is very important. And the thing that's most important here is that they are children and parents first. They're not foster children. They're not adoptive children. They're children. They're children who happen to have come into the family through adoption. They may be children who've been in foster care. We are parents, and you don't know this about me, but I am an adoptive parent. I've been a foster parent, and Allison is a relative caregiver. So we kind of cover the gamut here. I'm also a parent by birth, so I cover a lot of areas. First and foremost, with all of my children, however they came to me, is I'm a parent. And it's important for us to remember that there are three kinds of parents. There's genetic parents, those who give birth to the children, where our children carry our DNA from two family trees at least. And there are parenting parents, which would be our kinship parents, would be our foster or resource parents. And there are legal parents. And for many of our children, they are living with parenting parents. They have first birth families who are their genetic parents, and the courts, represented by social workers, are their legal parents. As adoptive parents, we will be the parenting parents and we will be the legal parents, but we will never be the birth first parents. And so we really have to talk about parenting in a very different way. Well, let's see, this isn't going forward. There we go. Our practice has changed. As I said, there's not separate waiting rooms for people. We spend a lot of time putting people together, not separating them. And in many ways, adoption has become about addition and not subtraction. It's about adding people into your life, into your family system. Our practice has changed considerably, and you'll notice that when we go through the core issues. Our stereotypes. We've had a lot of stereotypes and myths connected to our history of child welfare and adoption. And we often had to make birth first parents less than in order to find a good enough, comfortable reason to move children from this family into that family, from these family trees onto those family trees. And in that process, we have used very negative stereotypes and language that has been less than kind, very pejorative. And we have all the myths about adoption, that if we place children young enough, they won't remember anything, they won't be interested. If we place children who look like their parents, they don't even have to know they're adopted. So all of these things have come out of our old system of child welfare. But here's the new look at adoption and permanency. This is a new kind of triangle. And it puts all of us, all the constellation members, inside the triangle. We're all in there together, and we're surrounded by and have to address the issues of broken attachments, trauma, and the 7 core issues of adoption and permanency. And Allison is going to, in the second hour, look very much at those attachment and trauma impacts on children. But we need to be thinking about it for ourselves, which we will be doing in the next 2 sessions together. So we are all in this together. Whatever we do affects the other, and it affects the other lifelong and intergenerationally. And we all have to be conscious of attachment skills, attachment backgrounds, broken attachments, our trauma that we carry from our own childhood into the future, any trauma that has hit us in terms of infertility and child loss, and we all have to be conscious of our own core issues. So even children placed at birth experience attachment disruptions and relational trauma. And this comes out developmentally over time, because children take most of their early life, actually close to age 26, 27, when the brain is fully online, to fully understand what's happened to them. They get it in little bits and pieces, which Allison's going to be talking about. So this is the new wheel, if you will. I want to really point out, in looking at this wheel, that loss is the beginning. It's a really deeply intense, big set of losses. And so many times people say, oh, but everything we got, you know, we got the gains. But you can't really get the gains until you acknowledge the losses. We have to start acknowledging the losses. And the big losses are often easy to identify. But the devil's in the details. We really do need to look carefully at those little 1,000 paper cuts to the soul that come up for us every single day. Every time our child is asked, you know, who are their real parents? Every time we're asked, you know, how did you get those children? How much did it cost? There's 1,000 every time we take a child to the doctor and we're filling out medical forms. Those kinds of losses add up. And we don't bleed to death from them. They don't kill us, but they do change us. So these are losses that change us for life. They put us in a different trajectory in our life. And there is a purpose for how this wheel is connected. They're not random. Losses create feelings or fear of rejection, which impacts our self-worth, which then leads us to shame and guilt, which we're going to spend a few minutes on, which are self-esteem issues. Grief is the gateway to healing. Grief is the gateway to healing. And you can't do that without identifying the losses and addressing them. And then we get to the side of the wheel that moves us into the positive side, the gain side, the mastery side of these losses. So everybody's identity has changed. Our attachment challenges can affect our intimacy issues. And ultimately, everybody has lost control, and we have to find a way to master those losses. So simply put, this is the 7 core issues diagram. Adoption is about disassembling and reassembling of families on their various family trees, which, if you think about it in terms of the extension out there of our grandparents and great-grandparents, and both our birth mother's side of the family and our birth father's side of the family, can impact up to 16 family trees. And adoption isn't just about one generation. It changes those trees forever, which is why we see people coming back years later to search for relatives that are missing. They're trying to close that circle that's been broken. So we are in the business of disassembling and reassembling of families on their various family trees. And our job is to cut losses whenever possible. The losses for every constellation member are profound. And as I said, it changes the trajectory of your life. We don't always understand it at the time that it occurs. Sometimes we as families who bring children in don't realize how that's really going to be for us over time. We really don't get it at the time that we go through our family assessment. We don't always understand what's happening to a child when we move them into permanency. It unfolds as we develop and we go through the different phases of our life. So I'm now at the great-grandparent phase, and I'm still dealing with the 7 core issue losses. They come up every once in a while and surprise the heck out of me. It does impact our identity formation and our belief about ourselves, and our symptoms of loss manifest in our bodies, minds, and hearts. And you're going to look at an exercise a little bit later that would help you to tune into that. There are 3 kinds of losses, and I'm going to very quickly go through them. We do a deep dive in the book, and we will be looking at these more specifically as we address each side of the constellation. There are vicarious losses, those that feelings are catchy, and the feelings that are connected to loss frequently are traumatic. And if a family that we have done a family assessment with looks fabulous and 6 months later looks really not fabulous, and we think, oh my God, what did we miss? What happened? Very often, if we look at the trauma and the attachment challenges that a child has brought into that household and unpack their little suitcase of losses, the family catches, if you will, the emotional issues of the child or children if it's a sibling set, and they are now reverberating. They're now dealing with the same mental health issues, and those are vicarious losses, things that we catch from others. There are ambiguous losses. People are gone, but they're not gone. The birth first family is out there somewhere, and the child knows about it, dreams about it, fantasizes about it, worries about it, is afraid about it, but is also missing a sibling, wondering where they are, missing certain chocolate chip cookies from their grandmother. Our families may be very, very happy to have this child. Hopefully they are attaching and loving this child, but still wondering what it would have been like if they had met this child earlier before they suffered trauma, or wonder what it would like if they had given birth to this child, or may love this child very, very much, but still wonder what it would have been like to parent a child that they brought into the world through their own genetics. That's ambiguous loss. And secondary losses, which come up around Mother's Day, Father's Day, birthdays, all kinds of things that remind us that our family has formed in a different way. So we're going to be looking at that with each side of the constellation that we explore. And we're going to be looking at some ways to address those various types of losses. And one of them certainly is a loss history, and we're going to go deeper into that. So as I said, the feelings of loss, the experiences of loss are translated into feelings or fear of rejection. And there's a reason for that. Some of you have heard me talk about this over the years. And that is that one of the ways that we can control future loss is to personalize it and ask ourselves, what did we do to cause this loss? If we can figure it out, maybe those kinds of losses won't happen to us again. And this is particularly true for children, which Allison will be addressing. The losses, by the way, And the experiences or feelings of rejection can be real, they can also be imagined, and they can be implied. So they aren't necessarily as accurate. So parents may hear a child say something about, I'm afraid, or don't want to turn in my homework. Whatever, however it shows up in a child, which Allison will be addressing. And we can say, well, that never happened to you. But it doesn't make any difference. This is a feeling. It's not a fact. This is a feeling that lives in the head, in the heart, and in the body. So it definitely creates immediate negative feelings about oneself. And by the way, rejection actually is felt in the same part of the brain that pain is experienced. When we feel rejection, we can have physical pain. We can have headache. So when kids come home and they feel sick, sometimes it's directly connected to some form of rejection or fear of rejection that they're experiencing. And in fact, in doing research, they found that if you give somebody an aspirin or a Tylenol, they can begin to bring down those painful experiences of rejection that are being carried at that particular moment. It impairs logic and reasoning abilities. When we are fearful of rejection, if we're feeling rejected, we're not thinking clearly. And one of the ways that people deal with feelings or fear of rejection is to reject others first. So taking control. This is one of the ways that I can get back on top of things, is to take control and reject you. I don't need you. I don't have to listen to you. You're not my real parents anyway. Sometimes birth first parents will do this to the adoptive family. Sometimes the adoptive family will do this to the birth first family. Sometimes social workers feel, or therapists feel rejection because of other people's loss of power and control. Some people consistently move and change jobs and change plans and don't complete things as a way of dealing with fear or feelings of rejection. People who are routinely feeling rejected have poor sleep, poor eating habits, and their immune systems can be suppressed. So our kids particularly may be ill more often. People may lash out and attempting to externalize this pain by becoming angry or aggressive towards others, and we may see this with our birth first families. Or they may turn their pain inward, engaging in self-harming or self-destructive behaviors such as addictions. Brain scans show that the very same region, and I mentioned this already, so I'm not going to say it again, but the same regions of the brain are connected to rejection and physical pain. Now that's all about self-esteem. I don't feel good about myself. I'm afraid of committing myself. I'm afraid of putting myself out there. And my tool may be to get angry or not allow myself to be judged by others. Get the pain over with for some folks. Now, shame and guilt are very different. And guilt comes at a very early time. It can be the way somebody looks at you. It's them not looking at you. It's not paying attention to when you're being fed as a baby. And we're going to look for a minute at what is shame and what is guilt. And there is healthy guilt. I'm a Jewish mother, so I dispense healthy guilt all the time. But there's unhealthy guilt where we can cause people to feel like they'd like to disappear, shrink, withdraw, hide, escape. Many times we see children who just kind of sneak in around the corners of the room, or you don't even know they're there, you jump. These are kids that are trying to hide because of their unhealthy guilt. And the difference between the experience of being shamed from stigmatization, from mythology, from the words that are used are very powerful. It's a very powerful experience. So shame originates as a negative reflection from others. It's kind of an outside-in emotion. And very often children believe that they were the cause of what happened. And so they carry a great deal of shame. My birth mother looked at me and went, ugh, ugly baby, or I cried too much, or I wanted to eat too much. And so they personalize that shame. It lives in the mind and the body. And I'm sure almost everybody here has read Bessel van der Kolk's book on The Body Keeps the Score, because I think it really does show us how early we start collecting that shame in our cells, literally in our cells. Guilt develops from the earliest parent-child attachment experiences. So it's a learned social emotion. It teaches us to behave in society, to be respectful of others. And guilt is actually attached to attachment. So before we can have guilt, we have to have attachments. And before we can have attachments, we have to have first attachment, trust and attachment, and then a sense of conscience. And conscience development allows us to feel guilty. So first you have to trust the grown-ups you're with. And I have to trust the birth first family as an adoptive parent. They have to trust me as a foster parent or an adoptive parent. So this becomes extremely important. Once the trust is there, attachment can build. Once attachment builds, conscience can grow. And that doesn't happen really till around 3 or 4 completely. And by 7, guilt becomes one of the things that we do extremely well and receive extremely well. Maladaptive or unhelpful guilt is really a place of psychological discomfort that we developed against unrealistic goals. So very often parents who have very, very high goals for their children, and the children trying desperately to please their parents, where they're very frightened of rejection. And this happens in a lot of our families, where the parents have never really let go of the fantasy children they've had, or the children they thought they were going to be raising, may hold high expectations for a child who really is interested in entirely different things, has different kinds of talents, different types of learning styles, and that child can really develop some very unhelpful and maladaptive guilt. I love the look on that puppy. Okay, so part of this is a true understanding of self-esteem. And I want to show you that self-esteem is built on 4 pillars, all of which have nicks in them because of the losses associated with adoption, foster care, and relative caregiving. And they include a sense of uniqueness. And very often, we feel like we're unique because we're adoptive parents or foster parents or resource parents or grandparents who are taking care of our children. It's kind of how we're seen in the world. It's kind of how we're identified wherever we go. It may be the first thing out of our mouth. Hi, I'm a foster parent, or hi, I'm an adoptive parent. And who we are in the constellation becomes our uniqueness. But the truth is, no 2 human beings have the same fingerprints. Everybody's unique. Never before has there anybody been like us, and never ever will there be anybody like us in the future. That's just, we're unique. Our job is to figure out why we're here. What are we supposed to do? How are we unique, and what are we supposed to be doing? So that's our job, is to find out how each individual we work with, and treat every individual as unique and every child as unique. And that particularly becomes important when you're looking at a sibling group. They're not a sibling group. They're individual children with their own unique qualities, needs, and desires. So uniqueness often gets connected to the constellation labels, but it needs to be broadened and supported and explored. Role models. It's very difficult for families to find role models that have parented attachment challenged children, children with great trauma, who've succeeded, who've survived. Their marriage has survived. They have a sense of humor. They're doing great. They're physically healthy and mentally healthy. Adoptive families need, resource families need, kinship families need role models to see that they can do it too, and glean information from folks who've been down that road. Support groups are one of the ways that we get that. That's the same for our children. They need to know other children who have experienced foster care, or who have experienced adoption, or who are living with grandparents. And they have to know adults or teenagers, people ahead of them in the age that they're at, who are doing fine. So you can see that you can be fine, you know, because society sees a lot of our youngsters as troubled. And they need to know that they have the ability to succeed in life, no matter how they're presently living their lives. And Superman and Moses, etc., are not the best people to use. Even Olympic people who win gold medals, who happen to be individuals who were adopted, are not role models our kids can relate to. They need to know teachers, mental health specialists, social workers, neighbors, parents of their friends, members of their own family. And then we have to have role models that reflect give us our mirror images. So we have to have those folks who, particularly when we don't look at all like our family of origin, we need to have those folks who we can see ourselves reflected in. Connections. We need information. We need to know where we come from and who we can be in the future. And this is particularly important for our children. And last, a sense of belonging. We need to know who our clan is, who are our peeps, who are the folks we're connected to. And that again has to do with our family of origin, our birth first family, and not just half of them, not just the birth first mother. So many of our children grow up with only half their family trees connected to them knowledge-wise. They may lose the whole birth first father, and that limits your sense of belonging, your rootedness. And that's true for us as parents, birth first family. Who are our peeps? Who do we go to? Who claims us? Who do we claim? And the same for us as families by adoption, foster care, or relative caregiving. Grief is the gateway to healing. And the only way we can grieve is to know what we lost. And I go back and say again, the devil's in the details. It's the small things that we need to be able to make a list of and acknowledge. Just even the way our kids smell, or our parents smell, if we happen to be the child in the home who comes from another family first, or a smile, or medical needs. So often, the losses we're talking about they go unnamed, unacknowledged, and ungrieved. In a society that sees permanency for children as a win for everybody, there's no discussing losses. There's no discussing losses. And we have to name them, acknowledge them, and grieve them. And for our children, that's an ongoing long process. My belief, Allison's belief, is that if parents haven't done their grief work, they cannot help their children. Children get as far as their parents get in this process, which is why we've written a workbook that'll be available the end of this year for parents to look at their own core issues. And we're going to introduce you to some of that. So acknowledging the loss and making room for the gains is an essential part of the healing process. If our heart is filled with loss, there's no room for hope and joy. We have to make room. And it includes remembering, recollecting, questioning, reorganizing. It takes time from us. It's work. They call it grief work for a purpose. You have to set aside time, and you'll know when grief is coming up for you. Maybe it's an anniversary reaction. Maybe it's another loss. It is personal and highly individual. One person cannot tell another how to do this work, and there's no recipe or prescription to shorten the process. But if we don't do it, a big boulder in the road of life just remains there. Grief can make people feel crazy and unhinged, alone. Remember this in terms of children, please. On a roller coaster ride and out of control. Surprises, triggers that come up. It could be wallpaper, it could be a smell, it could be a taste. Very often the surprises come by way of our senses. We kind of wander aimlessly. We forget things. We don't finish what we start. And we find ourselves reading the same things over and over again because we can't concentrate. Our memories are impacted. So, if we can identify our losses, deal with our self-esteem and our fears and feeling of rejection, and we're going to give you tools for all this, look at our issues of shame and guilt. Do that work in grief. We can begin to build a solid identity. Stories that are broken due to historical and repeatedly broken events can make it difficult for people to understand their journey. And we need a coherent story to build a coherent identity. And so many of our children lead episodic lives. They lead a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. And different people hold pieces of their memories that may not get passed through to the next group. They may be lost forever. They may be inaccurate. So the words associated with identity are self-described or attributed by others and can be positive or destructive. But a person's mental model of themselves, their psychological identity, relates to their self-image, their self-esteem, and how a person sees themselves as unique. We're going back to that self-esteem uniqueness. Identity is based not only on what we are, but also what we are not. So I am a child of adoption, but I am a child who was born like everybody else. I do have extended genetic family out there. I do have extra family trees. I do have extra relatives. I am a parent to this child, but I did not give birth to this child. Recognizing both what is and what isn't is part of forming identity. And identity includes values, beliefs, our spiritual identification, our national and political associations, our talents, our intellectual capabilities, our sexual self-image, gender, and role, our collective and social identity, our personality traits, our racial, ethnic, and cultural heritage, our age. And think about all the losses that can be attached to any of these. That you were Catholic and now you're Muslim, or you were Muslim and now you're Jewish. Think about the shifts that are created that impact our identity. Think about the fact that you were being raised in an African-American family and now you're being raised in a Hispanic family. Or this family spoke Spanish most of the time and this family doesn't speak Spanish at all. These are all the losses that impact and can either enhance or diminish our identity, our personal expectations. So it springs from our experiences, perceptions, and interpretations of the past. That's why we need that story. That's why we need the whole story. Is reflected by others in the present by how we're perceived and labeled. That goes back to words, the importance of words. Sorry. and how we understand ourselves in relation to others. And all this allows us to project who and what we want to be into the future. So it emerges from relationships. Healthy identity formation allows constellation members to experience the gains of adoption and permanency, which then allows us to experience healthy intimacy. Healthy intimacy is based on attachment and a good self-image. They're together, they're linked together. We have to know who we are, what we bring to the table, what our needs and desires are. And that is something that happens over and over again. A person clarifies and reclarifies who they are, their ability to relate to others, to embrace others, forgive others. And we're going to talk about forgiveness as an important tool here, and trust others. So if we have all those losses and we haven't done that work and we haven't built our attachments and have a solid identity, our intimacy is greatly diminished. Adoption and permanency inherently impacts intimacy as people are shifted in and between family trees. These changes can send a message that individuals are easily lost, replaced, are interchangeable cogs in a wheel, that substitutions are easily made, and may give a person the feeling that building attachments is risky and creates pain. When information is withheld or unavailable, intimacy can become hampered by a lack of personal information. Who am I really? What's hidden in my genetic background? What's hidden in the resources of my genes? Intimate relationships are built over time by both verbal and nonverbal communication. It's becoming acquainted with the subtleties and nuances of both ourselves and another person. Intimacy develops through reciprocal self-disclosure. It involves risk, vulnerability, and a strong belief that you're valuable, resilient, and worthy of love. Well, how do we do that if we haven't addressed the earlier core issues? Our most basic primary motivation in life is to belong, to learn how to get our emotional needs met through human connections. Intimate attachments provide the network through which all social, emotional, physical, and psychological needs get met. Intimate relationships require trust, respect, acceptance, empathy, and reciprocity. Going back again to how this can become a big issue for everybody. It's like a dance. Each person has to understand themselves, their needs, feelings, expectations, and vulnerabilities. And we have to uncover our biases. Connections to others can be weakened by expectations that we have or that we feel others have of us. And we have to remember it's more than words that communicate feelings. It's about how we hold our bodies, how we make eye contact or don't, the tone of our voice, our facial expressions, our aversion to touch or our warmth of touch, and the matching of words and action and physical expressions. Our primary dance steps are learned in childhood, and they become more sophisticated over time. So last, and I'm going to be quick because I'm taking up Allison's time, the goal here is mastery. The goal here is mastery. It's a lot of hard work, but it enhances who we are overall. So people who have addressed the core issues are some of the most delightful, humane, fun human beings I know. People who have faced attachment challenges and trauma and done the work of the core issues are well worth knowing, being related to, and having as friends. And they're our best colleagues in the field. Mastery is a proficiency, a command of a subject, a skill, or a knowledge base, and includes mastery over one's life circumstances, which is deeply connected to our own self-awareness. Requires an individual to be open to risk, to making mistakes, to looking foolish, being willing to open up to intimate and emotional connections where we could have pain, There's no guarantee in any relationship. Mastery does not mean we're done grieving or processing our losses and complexities. It means we know where they are and where our vulnerabilities are and what we're going to do when they surface. Control is something we all lost. We all lost control in the beginning of this process. Child welfare brings social workers and judges and therapists and other professionals into the lives of constellation members. And for a while, they take over. And they can make us feel pretty helpless. The loss of control over a person's early life journey can inhibit their power to direct their future life courses. And I love this. Who's driving? Who's driving these cars? Where are they going? Who's in control? What crashes could occur here? What losses? Loss of control is limiting. Mastery is expansive. So dramatic losses and multiple attachment disruptions and trauma and assaults on our impact our need to feel empowered, secure, and valued. Individuals may have a need to over-control all aspects of their lives and other people's lives and may withdraw from even trying in some instances and not do anything. So we have the over-controllers and we have those who stop trying as a reaction to their loss of control. Now we have a habitual behavioral system that functions at a very deep level of our conscious thought, and it's very difficult to change. So all those early losses have become habituated in the way that members of the constellation may respond. So it requires bringing it all up into awareness and then practice to create different patterns of behavior. That's what mastery does. And you know what? Along the way, we make a lot of mistakes. We fall up the steps, we fall down the steps, we take 2 steps forward, we make 1 step back. Our kids need to see adults struggling with mastery. They need to know that it's okay to fail, that we don't always have to be in control. So self-awareness is an aspect of mastery. We have to know that every constellation member matters. We're all in the boat together. So every constellation member matters. It means we have to bring into our conscious awareness our belief system about the self, others, and the world. What is our world view, our self view, and the other view? We need to gather and gain knowledge. All constellation members need to clarify, construct, and claim their stories. We as adults, we as professionals need to know our stories. What are we bringing to our work? And we have to be willing to practice, practice, practice. So for those of us in the field, it's a minimum of 5 years before you even begin to feel like you understand this. It's a long haul for mastery. And the longer I'm in it, and it's well past 55 years now, if you go into 1963, I'm pushing 60 years in this field, I will tell you that I'm very aware that I'm still working on mastery every day, because every family, every client, every individual brings a different story that I have to learn with them to master. I'm going to turn this over now to Allison. Are you there?
Oh my goodness, I am here. Can everybody hear me? I have to tell you, as I'm listening to Sharon, this roadmap that she's walking us through, that the complexities, I'm sitting here having so much empathy for our parents. I know we have some of our parents right now with us. So think about our, oops, I have to go way back, so sorry. our parents that are, my goodness, you guys are probably like cursing me right now. Our parents that have to do what we call double time. So their own core issues, which Sharon just walked you through globally, the core issues, and then the child's issues, which I'm going to be doing this next hour. But all of you parents kind of welcome, and we honor and bless you and need you desperately. And this roadmap that Sharon's just walked you through, I want you to imagine it's like a freeway. I want you to kind of see the core issues as this freeway. And right now I'm going to be going down one lane of the freeway. So think of the child, the teen, the adult, but that's one lane on the freeway. And then we're going to be doing the birth first parent and family. That's another lane of the freeway. And then another lane for our resource, our kin and our adoptive parents. That's another lane. But they're all connected, and the roadmap, the freeway, has a lot of connections. So the core issues becomes this unifying principle. When Sharon, and again, I bow to Sharon, and thank you so much. It's just always an honor to listen to you walk us through this conceptual framework. That these losses are really, for the child specifically, unlike any other life losses. So when we think of losses, some of us go, well, I lost a job and I got divorced, and we know loss. The losses in adoption and permanency connected to foster, and what happens when we're disconnecting children from their familial trees and systems, are unlike any other losses. They are really profound as they change the trajectory of where my life was going. I was going on this path, born to this family, and now I'm going down this path, this family. And that's, again, the lifelong issues, because as I'm moving through being 5 years old and 10 years old and 15 years old, more losses unfold. It's not just that I'm moving down this freeway and my losses were behind me. As I age and develop and can think more abstractly, I begin to really understand what my losses are. So when we think about our children, and I'm just watch these fall into the screen here on the PowerPoint. When Sharon mentioned uniqueness, think about every single child being completely unique with their own temperament, their own personality characteristics, and yet all of these other issues, from in utero exposure to how many disrupted attachments did they have, how many times did we move the child, how many times are they losing folks that they loved and were connected to, their siblings, how much trauma their sensory system absorbed. There's nothing more complex than the human brain, the human mind. And as I move through today, I'll kind of be weaving some of the brain-based components in, because I don't really do anything anymore without talking about the brain, the complexity of us humans. But when you think specifically about our children that come into child welfare and foster care from neglect and from trauma and a lot of attachment disruptions, I want us to be holding all of these things that impact our children in our mind moving forward. Because one of the first things that our children lose, as you heard Sharon saying, is this thing called attachment. And I would have you guys for a second, because I could spend 3 days on attachment, but what I'd have you all do is kind of lean into it with me and hold your hands up like this. Can you guys hold your hands up like this? And I want you in here, Michaela, I can see you doing it with me. In here, see this space in here? That's love. And love is wonderful, and we love love. Love is fabulous. And attachment, I want you to pull your hands like this as far as is humanly possible for you. And know that this is attachment, and bring it back to love. I want you to go, oh, love is very nice. Love is wonderful. We like love. And attachment is something very different. And eventually, through attachment, we learn this thing called love. But when we come into the world, we don't know love. We actually need to learn love as well as a lot of other feelings. But love is nice, but attachment is much different. That in our mind, sometimes we can equate this thing called love and attachment, and it's just not a good thing to be equating. That the child actually has to learn this dance of attachment, which is much more about getting their needs, developmental and attachment needs, met through human connectedness. They have to learn this dance, this serve and return dance of reciprocity. And they're learning it from the moment they enter the world. If they lose initially their primary attachment caregivers, one of the first things they lose is this thing called unconditional love, which is much more about an unconditional commitment to my needs. So if I have high needs, my parents don't go, oh, well, your needs are too high, so we'll move you somewhere else. This unconditional commitment to my needs, whatever those needs are, is what so many of our children lose. That once they lose attachment on their familial systems trees, that connection, that they're rooted somewhere in their clan, that they can lose this sense of, well, who's claiming my needs? This isn't about love initially. They need to be claimed. Their needs need to be claimed. And I'm going to be speaking a bit more to that. But I want you, as you look at these images, be thinking about this thing called attachment, and know that mammals attach, high-functioning mammals attach. We're basically high-functioning mammals, right? They attach to survive, first of all, but also to learn caregiving, to learn this thing called love, to learn intimacy. These are learned in high-functioning mammals. It's actually why humans have an extended childhood. The human brain isn't done developing till 25. Amazing. So the purpose initially really is much different than just this thing called love. It's really here so the child's needs, especially, and I want to be specific around their developmental needs, which includes learning to regulate and modulate their distress. So I have to learn how to go from high distress to being regulated, which is one of the first areas our kids tend to struggle. That they struggle feeling regulated, moving into homeostasis, because they're not in a primary attachment caregiving situation, which requires permanency. You can't keep moving me and moving me and moving me and think I'm getting my primary attachment and developmental needs met. It doesn't happen. So we have kids that have internalized so much distress, they didn't learn regulation. I don't even know how to find this thing called homeostasis, which means I'm internally in a biological state. I can find resting heart rate, a resting respiratory rate, kind of relax into attachment and allow my caregiver to remove my distress. This takes claiming and a primary attachment caregiver who's permanently connected, who claimed my needs. So here what you see is attachment is primarily about survival. But for humans, it has all of these secondary purposes, right? They actually learn so much through this serve and return of attachment. So I want us to kind of think about it, as Sharon was saying earlier, like children have to learn this dance. And you guys see the happy dance just can. My hope is that all of you are singing that in your head. Because when children's needs are met on their attachment dance floor, so when they first come into the world, if my needs are claimed right away, if every time I'm hungry I get fed, or every time I'm scared at 2 in the morning, someone comes in and soothes me and comforts me, when my needs are met, I actually learn to give my needs to you, to the grown-ups. So I'm singing the happy dance because most of my suffering has been removed. And you are also on this dance floor bringing me so much joy and love and pleasure. You're rocking me and holding me, and you're there for me. I don't feel this sense of deep loneliness and isolation and disconnection. That's over here. What's on the other dance floor for our kids of neglect or trauma and attachment disruptions? What if there are sharks on my dance floor? Pain and suffering and loss. And what if I've had 6 mothers and 4 fathers? and all of them have let me go. And in my mind, that's how I perceive it. Where did all those people that loved me go? And why don't I see them? And why am I not connected to them? So what I may be learning on my dance of attachment, if I'm this child, is to fear attachment, to loathe attachment, to push you away. In fact, many of our kids may come up with quote, oppositional defiant disorder, which is one of my least favorite diagnoses in this whole book, called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, because it really is, quote, a disorder of attachment. That what am I opposing on this dance floor? Why am I in this defiant oppositional mode? Because I'm opposing attachment, because I never learned these skills to attach, because I don't have anyone potentially meeting my attachment needs. So this loss for the child is profound when they lose primary attachment caregivers who are claiming my needs. The role of the parent is to be the external psychobiological regulator of the child's internal affective states. So again, love, remember, love was this nice thing. This is not about love. This is about claiming, as the parent, it's my role. It's why we have so much empathy and love for our parents, our foster resource parents and kin parents, that are becoming the external psychobiological regulator of their child's internal affective states. And imagine what you're claiming is a lot of trauma and suffering and pain, because most of our children carry so much distress in their biological systems, in their mind states. If our parents don't really know enough about the tasks in attachment and this role, committing to claiming the needs, the development and attachment needs of a child. So we unpack this and break this down. What does all this mean? What am I claiming really? The parent, if I'm becoming the external psychobiological regulator of the child's internal affective states, I'm claiming that every one child has these 5 critical areas of development. From their physiological development, which again is the gatekeeper, which is why that red bucket is red. It's body first and brain first. So from their physiological development to their social development, their emotional development, their cognitive development, and their conscience development, that all of these areas have been impacted through neglect, through attachment disruptions, through traumatic losses. So our parents are claiming these developmental areas that often have deficits, a lack of pro-socializing due to living in the foster system maybe for 5 years, or having 6 different mothers as I've moved and moved and moved, right? So they have increased developmental needs coming from these areas. And if we look at it from more of an, I'm going to unpack this a little bit more of a brain-based way, that when that brand new brain comes into the world, and I want us to think about the first 3 to 4 years where the brain's growing up to 90% of its capacity, brain growth, the first 3 to 4 years. What we used to think about the little one, and again, this is, think about 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, is, it doesn't matter so much what happens because they don't remember. They don't remember. And we did a lot of minimizing, especially around the turn of the century. Just minimizing this myth that, like, well, they don't remember it, so it doesn't really matter anyway. What we've learned is the absolute opposite is true. That core structures of the brain, I want you to look at the blue part, what we call the limbic structures, where the amygdala is and the hippocampus. That little brain is absorbing everything through their sensory system on an emotional level. Every single thing that happens to that little brain is creating the neuronal pathways, the interconnections in the limbic structures. So how important are the first 3 to 4 years? This tendency to think, oh, well, we move them and move them and move them, and I'm not saying we do it intentionally because we have limited resources in the system, but all of these things have tremendous impact on the developing brain. And what's happening here for children who are left in high states of dysregulation, because we keep moving them from the person that learned to regulate them to this other person, the new parent. And by the way, attachment relationships, as you heard Sharon say, are never interchangeable. When you move me from one daddy to another daddy, I'm mourning and grieving the losses of my other daddy, how he held me and his voice and his smell, and I was attached through my senses to him. So when you disrupt attachment, I'm grieving and distressed, and I'm not attached to this new person. So you've created more distress that then gets embedded and encoded within the limbic structures of the brain. So where do all these, quote, behaviors come from? That word drives me crazy as well. You hear some of my little triggers. behavior. My hope is as we unpack this all makes much more sense for us. So the chronic distress that's now woven into the limbic structures, into the sensory system of the child's brain from all of this chronic distress. And where do these often, quote, behaviors come from? And this is what's going to be moving into the new family. And the child will be unpacking, as you heard Sharon say, which is all that vicarious trauma, the vicarious losses. And what we're asking our parents to be doing is not moving away from the distress, sending the child away from them, go to your room, or we actually need our parents to be doing time-ins, to pull all that distress towards them. And much easier said than done. These stress responses for children, most of our children in the child welfare system include children in residential treatment centers and long-term foster care and group homes that are not rooted in permanency. When children have their root structures dangling, it's like they're treading water in the bend of the pool. Chronically treading water from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, if they go to bed, because they're probably up all night and hoarding food and highly distressed, and they're in the state of chronic toxic stress. You see the red light? Chronic toxic stress. And then we send them to school. I think a lot of learning is happening that they can retain and comprehend. You don't learn a lot when you're in the deep end of the pool treading water, and we are teaching you something like, why aren't you paying attention and why aren't you listening? And our children are in chronic states of distress. And what they need the most, what their biological system needs the most to heal, is permanency, is rootedness, is someone to claim. They need attachment. And remember, it's what they lost. It's why their greatest loss is the gift that keeps on giving if we don't get them rooted in permanency. I'm not going to spend too much time on ACEs. I know some of you are very familiar with ACEs. But one of the things that I want us to kind of frame around understanding ACEs is what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. It builds a brain. It builds a sensory system. It's why these lingering effects of all of the distress and trauma that are now embedded and encoded within the limbic structures of the child's brain create a lot of distress for the child. And not just in their behaviors. Where do these behaviors come from? And I love this image of the child because you see the body of the child. So the body's impacted, you see the heart, emotions impacted, and you see the brain. Our children are developing a narrative, a belief about self. As you heard Sharon talking about self-esteem, learning about themselves, they're developing a belief system. What I think about me, how I feel about me. A lot of the challenges with our children come from this narrative and belief system. They're learning every day about themselves. Their internal working model, again, that belief about self. The good thing is that these things are malleable. These things are changeable. I want to be getting to some of our tools around losses, because as you heard Sharon say, what we don't acknowledge, we can't heal. Have to be acknowledging these losses. And ACEs is really the gateway drug. We used to think other drugs were the gateway drug. What we know is the gateway drug, which we've learned from ACEs, is trauma, and more trauma, and specifically developmental trauma. The child that's in the deep end of the pool, do you guys see the developmental trauma triangle? still in survival mode. They can't regulate well because their needs haven't been claimed. So you can send me to school all the time, and I can't really learn all that I need to be like my same aged peers that don't have developmental trauma, because all of those same aged peers are in what we call the typical development. They're not swimming in the deep end of the pool. Their sensory system can find homeostasis and calmness and organization in their mind state. They can learn and attend and focus and stay calm when demands are put upon them, like it's homework time. Our kids get easily triggered and distressed when those demands are placed upon them because they're in chronic stress. So I only include this one in particular because all trauma is not created equal. And I think sometimes because of our more trauma-informed language that we use this word kind of trauma. All trauma is not created equal. And developmental trauma hits all 5 areas of development. Can you guys see in your mind's eye those 5 different developmental areas? Physiological development, emotional development, social development, cognitive development, and conscience development. Developmental trauma impacts all 5 of those developmental areas in a significant way. So having parents be focused on what they're adding developmentally, what experiences are they adding pro-socially to help catch me up, if you will, developmentally, is what's critical. Because traditional parenting doesn't help, quote, catch me up. It punishes me for my mistakes. So I have lots of behaviors in distress. And if you have the notion that you're going to punish me and that's how I'm going to learn, because punishment means to inflict pain or harm. I'm suffering more. What can we take away from you because you keep making this mistake? So the principles of punishment backfire. We want to use positive discipline and pro-social discipline that helps me learn from my mistakes and make mistakes okay. Because these losses for me can feel very overwhelming. So Sharon and I, when we were writing the book, we teased out all the losses for all the members of the constellation. I'm zeroing in on just the child. The child loses more than any other constellation member at a time developmentally where they had zero control and power over any of these losses. They weren't making any of the decisions about when they were moving, what they were losing, how much they were losing. I'm going to lose my siblings, I'm going to lose my parents, I'm going to lose my grandparents. They have zero control over all of these losses. So what could be a tool? So I've laid out some of this, and I want to break it down because one of the things that Sharon and I did is we laid out the end of each chapter tools to address these core issues. So I want to give you a specific tool for the child, the teen, the adult. One of the things you heard Sharon say is, you can't grieve what you haven't acknowledged. If I don't know what my losses are, how do I grieve? Do you hear the ambiguousness of it? So our children are grieving, which can often show up like anger. We have some of the angriest kids on the planet, right? Filled with rage and triggers, and they're angry. Well, anger is just a process of grief. That all this unresolved trauma, all these losses have created tremendous distress and grief and hurt and pain and suffering. That doesn't just hit my mind, my psychology. Think about my narrative. It hits my body. It hits my emotions. Think about my emotional development. So think about this tool. And one of the things I do with the child, I get those of you that are therapists and even all of our parents, I take a big butcher piece of paper and I trace the child over this big piece of butcher paper. Because we're going to draw the body. And why do we draw the body? Because we're going to draw this unique child. So I just do an outline. By the way, it's usually pretty big, and I do it with teens as well. What's the story we tell ourselves in our mind about these losses? I draw the heart on this piece of butcher paper. Let's put all the feelings that have gone into your heart from all these losses that you've had. Where do you feel? Where in your body do these losses show up? Lots of times I'm just using colors. I'm using this as kind of an art project. So it really helps us look at wherever that child is, they may be 5 or 8 or 15, just to begin to understand this basic concept that all these losses, all of this trauma has been embedded and encoded within the body. And within the body lives emotions. And within the body lives the brain. In fact, I draw a little brain in there too. What are the things we tell ourselves about why this happened to me? Maybe I tell myself I'm bad. Maybe I tell myself I'm stupid. Maybe I tell myself I'm dumb and nobody loves me, nobody likes me. Those are the real things many of our children say that are in their mind. One of the things Sharon and I did, and I'm not going to go through each of these because we have a few more webinars that we're going to be doing, but all of the tools that we put in the back of each section help us to address the core issues for all members of the constellation. And then we also added, that you all see at the bottom there, what we call notes to professionals. What should professionals be aware of as we're supporting various members of the constellation, if we're working with our birth first families, with our kin, foster and adoptive parents, and with our children and teens and adults? So all of those losses create, as you heard Sharon say, feelings or fear of rejection. Where would the child, or how would the child feel rejected? Rejected by whom? And rejection is really tricky. These feelings of abandonment that our children have. That they can feel like those two trees. Our children have a maternal familial tree and a paternal familial tree. It's not, quote, just my birth first mother and my birth first father. They were connected to a whole familial tree, which included a root structure, branches with different family members, grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles and siblings, and a culture, a race, an ethnicity, a story, right? So this whole maternal familial tree and paternal familial tree, why am I not connected to that? And I'd have you think, as a child thinks about it, why didn't they fight harder for me? Why didn't they come back for me? Why did they choose drugs over me? I've had many children frame it just like that. Like they chose that over is how it feels. That they can feel really rejected from that familial tree. Why didn't they come for me? For our children that get adopted internationally, wasn't there anyone in that country that wanted me? Why did I have to lose my whole country, a culture, a language, my nationality? This sense of rejection can feel really intense for the child who now has their roots dangling. I'm not rooted anywhere. And where are those trees that I'm supposed to be? Those trees that, quote, created me. So what is a tool that we can work to assist? And by the way, it was hard to actually find one tool because there's a ton of tools, but I tried to pick some that I thought would be the most helpful. Sharon and I took this last year of COVID, and we've been working on a workbook, which is different than the 450-page book that is this. The workbook is all experiential, with activities and questionnaires and visuals and practice tools that basically look like this. What the child might need us to do is look at their circles of belonging. And imagine this is the child. And who's in their inner circle? Where do they feel a deep sense of belonging, a deep sense of connectedness? For some of my children, that may be nowhere. Our children who are in residential treatment centers right now, they don't feel often a deep sense of belonging and connectedness, like who really knows me, who's claimed me, who cares about my needs and my life, who's showing up in the middle of the night when I feel really distressed and overwhelmed. That we have an inner circle, we have a secondary circle, and then an extended circle, which might be our community or teachers or other folks. That we want to be able to put this together for our children. How do you think this feels from the interior of the child, not from the outside in? These are often activities to be doing with our children, with our teenagers, to see if there are ways we can strengthen and move folks from an outer circle to an inner. But for us, it then helps us to understand kind of where all of this pain and these feelings of abandonment and rejection can come from. That just because we move a child, let's say they're 8 years old, into a new family, that these circles don't change right away. You have to be claiming me and help me feel like I belong with you in your family if you're claiming my needs. Put pictures of us up on the wall, talk about our future together, claim me, learn about my uniqueness, learn about my deep feelings of hurt and pain, learn about my strengths also, and feed those strengths. So this exercise, doing the circles of belonging, is a great activity to be doing with some of our children that get stuck in long-term foster care. Tools for other members of the constellation. These are all great tools. These are just a few of the ones that are pulled from the back of the chapter in Rejection. The note to professionals here is really that the child may reject any and all of us. They may have times rejecting their new parent. I hate you, take me back, and I'm calling the social worker, and I hate you. And they may use emotional distance to try to protect themselves when their feelings get triggered around closeness. In fact, the closer you get sometimes to our children, the more distress it may create because of this fear that you're going to see who I really am. Maybe you'll see that I am really bad, or that maybe I'm not really lovable. It's just how they might be feeling due to all of their losses and experiences of rejection or abandonment. And all of this rejection, feeling like these 2 trees didn't hold on to me, and maybe I've had 4 homes or 6 different placements in foster care. That's all rejection, abandonment, rejection. It's how it feels to the child. Can lead to shame and guilt. And Sharon talked about the difference between shame and guilt. Many of our kids stuck more in long-term foster care with lots of disruptions get stuck in a shame-based interior. That what happened to me? They're answering that question often because it's me. It's my fault. Like I deserve this. This shame-based interior due to their egocentric thinking. I remember that for children in particular, they're like the sun in the solar system. Like I think through everything like I'm the sun. So if something bad happens, it's my fault. It's actually why we need professionals and parents to be talking a lot about what happened and why it happened and putting a narrative around it and circling back to it. Even if it happened 2 years ago or 1 year ago, through each stage of development, when the child's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, we're circling back and helping the child have a deeper understanding of what happened and putting it through into the responsibility of the grown-ups. That the child didn't do anything wrong or bad or naughty to create these circumstances. That we have to be telling them this story of adoption and do a lot of telling. There's, even if the truth is difficult to tell, that we want to make sure our children have a narrative to understand what happened, why it happened. So they're not blaming themselves, which can keep them in a very shame-based place. So the shame and the guilt, when the child's disconnected from their primary attachment caregivers, has absorbed a lot of developmental trauma. Much of the time what our parents, and this is why having organizations like Children's Bureau and mental health professionals that use attachment family systems that are as their orientation and that are completely trauma informed and permanency competent, because it's our parents that will be doing the real healing work. And I want to say actually to all the professionals here, that a child coming to see Allison for an hour a week does almost nothing. It's about like dog do, not to insult all of us therapists, but me working with, as the client, the attachment caregiving system to activate the healing potential in the attachment caregiving system. That's really where we're able to, instead of moving like a snail, we can move like a jackrabbit, because healing takes place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, within the rootedness of permanency. helping our parents kind of unpack and make sense of complex behaviors, complex trauma triggers, because our kids are some of the most complex kids on the planet. So having the parent in the attachment caregiving system as the client really assists us addressing what we call this dance of fear and shame. That on the attachment dance floor between parent and child, and this is what can make it so tricky for our parents, is that all of this fear and distress has been embedded and encoded, remember the limbic structures, around human connectedness. So imagine that what the child needs the most to heal, again, the attachment dilemma, what I need the most to heal is what I fear the most. Imagine just the overwhelming, our poor parents much of the time, as they get closer and closer, it's so triggering and distressing for children, because remember what's on their attachment dance floor. That what happened in the past doesn't stay in the past. It built a brain and a sensory system. That our parents have a tremendous amount of healing work and healing power. It's actually the good thing. But often they need a support from professionals that can support the attachment caregiving system. They need to know as much about attachment and their child as I do, or else they will step into a lot of what we call trauma triggers on that dance floor. And those trauma triggers feel like a bear trap. You know, when a bear trap catches your legs on the dance floor, these triggers trigger us as parents, because emotions are contagious. So I can get just as easily triggered on this dance floor. So these brain structures, remember the emotional system, the limbic system, these brain structures that are involved with fear, shame, trauma, toxic stress. What's a tool that we can use for parents? And I love to use this tool with parents, and this has to be experiential, because these patterns that have been embedded and encoded within the structures of the child's brain, they were through repetition, hundreds, maybe thousands of repetitions. They don't get undone through us saying something once or twice as a parent. That's just not how change occurs within the limbic structures. Change occurs within the limbic structures when we activate those parts of the brain. When you want deeper parts of the brain to change and heal, you have to activate those parts. You have to actually create emotion in the parts. So this tool that I love that Sharon and I put in our workbook, it's called self-acceptance. You see the child looking into the mirror. When our children often look into the mirror, they see something they don't like. Me, and I don't like me. Nobody likes me. That I see a bad or damaged or ugly or mean, or I see something bad when I look in the mirror. And that's that self-image, that interior that we actually want to change. So imagine we helped them practice this thing called radical self-acceptance, which actually they need to hear from their person that's claiming. Remember we talked about attachment? Somebody that's claiming, helping me change my internal working model from one that's really negative, like I hate me, or I'm stupid, or I'm dumb, or I'm ugly, into liking me. So you're going to help me every day find 10 things that you're going to be saying to me, and then I'm going to repeat them. These are 10 things that I like the most about you. And I'm going to listen to you say those things about me as we're looking in the mirror, and then I'm going to repeat them. And you may have to do it over and over and over again. And by the way, when we're doing that, it's what is into their limbic structures, a very different emotion and then belief about self. Because these deeply held beliefs don't change easily. They take repetition and practice. This is how we get to mastery. So because I'm short on time, I'm going to move a little bit quickly so we make sure we get to grief. By the way, all those tools are in the book. And I know Sharon mentioned this early, but we're tremendous over-preparers, so we've actually put much more in here that we can get to. But the losses, if we haven't identified the losses for the child, like quote how do we grieve those losses that lead to the feelings of rejection from where, that create the deep feelings of shame and or guilt. And then grief, which is where, quote, the work is. This is where the work for the child is. But I have a lot to grieve. And even if I was adopted as a baby, and the tendency is to think, oh, we adopted you as a baby, so you don't have grief. And that is absolutely not true. In fact, the intensification of all the grief and loss issues are adolescents. Because now the child has the ability to think abstractly and think and feel really deeply about what they lost. Now they know more about what they lost. I can look at those two maternal and paternal familial trees. I can really grasp how adoptions impacted me and my life and who I am. So now I feel those losses in a much more significant. And what we know about grief and grieving is it's messy. It's really messy, right? There are just, quote, 5 stages. There's many more stages that we actually go through. And it's not this clean, linear process. In fact, Sharon and I did a deep dive in grief and grief. We really wanted to kind of update this process for our children. And I actually love this picture because you look at it really closely, it is how it feels to our children. That this is what they look at in the mirror. Remember, I just did that mirror image exercise. This is why I might not want to look at myself in the mirror, because I don't like what I see in the mirror. I see someone that other people didn't love, or they rejected, or they treated, or that I wasn't valuable enough to be held on to. That grief comes in waves of emotion. And for our kids, it can often show up with anger and with distress and self-loathing. And there's often these anniversary responses that hit their sensory system that our kids don't typically understand. One of the things I'm often sharing with parents is that children don't have an insight internally around all of these complex things. So when parents ask, or professionals ask, well, why did you do that? And why are you feeling that? And why? I would have you write why, circle it, and X it out. It's one of the least things to be asking our young kids, why? Because there often really isn't one why. There's about 100,000 whys. And it's way too complex in the interior of their mind to put the why, which moves them up into what we call executive functioning, into a narrative. And most often in the moment, what they need to be able to do is emote, is actually to discharge from their body and sensory system. All of this deeply held emotion, often we're the ones helping make sense of. It's really okay to feel all these things and have these big, overwhelming feelings that need to come out of their sensory system. Too often we go to, well, why are you doing that and why? And when we pull them into their language receptors, which by the way is in their left hemisphere, we can shut down feeling and affect, which we don't want to do, especially in the moment. So what are some of the tools around grief? If you think about the complexity of feelings, that children in particular, they have to learn how to feel through their body and through their sensory system. At first we have to experience feelings before we put a word to it and say, this is what I'm feeling, which is a tremendously complex process. So the sensory system, I feel something, and then I have to move it into language, which is in the left hemisphere, and go, oh, that's what this feeling is. Move it into my left hemisphere and then communicate it to another human being. And remember, I fear. I want to be thinking about the complexity of what we're asking 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds to do well. And they struggle with it all the time. So having lots of tools and resources that help our children, and I'm going to show you some of these. My hope is that one of you can put these into. These are all the ones that I use pretty consistently. It's a great book called Tear Soup. That I need to learn what it feels like to, or how to communicate what I've lost and all the suffering that I've gone through. The boy with big feelings. Wow, there's a boy with big feelings? Yeah, and he can feel like a grumpy monkey most of the time. And that one of my other favorite ones, Riley the Brave. about what it feels like to have a lot of trauma that scares you all the time, and you can't even make the words to figure out all this trauma. And then this one, the hug who got stuck, another one of my favorite ones. The complexity of thinking children know how to express and articulate all the grief, loss, and suffering. That these are all of the books and tools that we need to be having around our offices or at home with our children, so they can increase their EQ. And their emotional quotient is to kind of learn this thing called emotion. I have to relearn this language, because most of our kids have had too much suffering and not enough pleasure. So emotions are really tricky for our kids and families, especially for our family. Kids are unpacking all of their trauma and anger and distress at a time, and I want us to think about their grief like this. Their grief and trauma needs to be co-regulated with their grown-ups. So we need to have grown-ups, parents that know an awful lot about emotional development and how to teach kids how to express and articulate and learn these. Oh, it's so funny that Sharon just put that in there. Sharon, it's so funny because we are always thinking, I think we have the same brain sometimes. You see the book that Sharon just put in there? The Double Dip Feelings? Just and Sharon. You're amazing. The complexity of grief, and it's why I wanted to break it down a little bit like this. We have to first perceive emotion through our sensory system, think body, and emotional development. So from what we smell to feel in our sensory system, create a thought. And I say this because sometimes I hear parents and even teachers go, oh, use your words, use your words, use your words. And for our kids, there's nothing more complicated than trying to take what they're feeling and move it into language, which is executive functioning. Remember, they're in the deep end of the pool. Their ability to access executive functioning is sometimes really minimized. I think we often overestimate our kids' abilities to do this. So weaving these things into our everyday activities, from the books that we're reading, to the art, to coloring your feelings with different colors, because these are the 4 areas that get us to increase emotional intelligence. And we certainly need us professionals and us parents that are helping to heal children have increased EQ. So the things that parents can do to help a grieving child not shut down big feelings too quickly by putting words to it. Language is highly overestimated. Us grown-ups sometimes put way too many words. We actually keep the words at a minimum. Most of this is through nonverbal attunement. You bring those big feelings to mommy. You bring those big feelings to daddy. Don't be alone with all those big feelings. You bring those here. I'll feel those feelings with you. And we're helping to frame. I understand you're going to have all those big feelings. You've had 6 different mommies. You have a lot of different mommies in your life. So I'm going to help you with all those big feelings. And that work to kind of push children away or think we can do a timeout when what they most need is a time in to get regulated again. And that healing is a process. And a lot of their grief shows up in somatic. See the physical responses? My stomach hurts, or I don't want to eat, or I overeat. Like it's our bodies that I can't sleep at night. I'm like a caged animal. Remember those when in the olden days when you used to go to zoos and animals were stuck in these little cages? That can be how it feels to be stuck with all this traumatic grief and loss. And our kids can feel like they're just ready to explode. So to have them have a daily discharge, like every day you and mommy are going to go for a walk, or we're going to play in the sand, or we're going to color your feelings. I'm going to check in all the time about what you're feeling and talk about my own feelings. Because one of the things I can do to re-educate the emotional brain, or the limbic structures, is to use play. And every interaction between parent and child when we're using play is helping add to those areas of social and emotional development. Because in play, we're going through this up and down of emotional experiences where I might have to wait my turn if we're playing Yahtzee. So I have to learn to delay gratification. and manage my impulses when I'm waiting for it to be your turn. So we use a lot of interactive play because we can re-educate the emotional brain. It's not going to be through us talking it to death, by the way. Talk, 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 and more talk. Oh my goodness, and I'm looking at my time. We're certainly going to go a few minutes over. So identity. We are all on this for identity. And one of the things that Sharon and I did was really kind of tease out and unpack the complexity of human identity. But as it relates specifically to our children, our teens, our adults, who are on this quest because they've been disconnected from their maternal familial tree and their maternal familial tree, and can then be rooted and planted in trees that might feel really different to them. Like, I don't see myself mirrored in this family. That for the child, it can feel like this. Well, I came from this maternal familial tree and this paternal familial tree, and now I'm in this adoptive family tree with this parent and this parent. So my identity formation, I have to integrate all these different trees into one amazing me. So there's activities that we've done to kind of build, especially for us to know this as well as parents and professionals, that this is the complex task of adolescence, when the primary task really is identity formation. I have to figure out who I am. And adoption and permanency just made this 100 times more complex because of this. Helping the child be able to figure this out and work through not just the fact-based components of this, but come to a cohesive narrative and identity formation around this. The life book is a great tool. That's why that specific tool needs to include all the parts of my history and story and lineage. It's often common for adoptive parents to begin that story with their story. So, oh, we went and got you at the hospital, or we went to the orphanage and got you, or we went to here and we picked you up from your old foster home. That the life book doesn't begin there. The life book begins here. That's the life book. That's the beginning of the child's story. And part of that story is what happened. What happened to those two familial trees that helps me understand why I'm not with them. I have to understand narrative and there are losses embedded within that narrative. And it took all of those to make one amazing me. That's why that's one of my favorite books, is the life book for the child. And while it takes an awful lot of work for us to do, I often put it in a 3-ring binder with slip covers because we're adding and adding, because information changes over time. Where that birth first mother was 10 years ago is often not where she is today. If she's gotten sober and there's openness and she's connected to the child, that story may have changed. She might be married with more children now. We are adding and updating that life book so it's not old, outdated information. So imagine that identity, those challenges, that if I've done some of that work, if we've created openness, and openness is keeping kids connected to all the important caregivers that played a role in my life and helped me remember my story, that it's easier then for me to do intimacy because I know who I am. Remember Sharon was kind of talking about this thing called identity and intimacy, that if I don't know who I am, like I love this visual of the cow going meow, how do I get close if I don't know what happened and I think it's my fault? And that losing my connections makes me fear more loss and abandonment. So getting close and attaching, doing what we call emotional intimacy, is difficult if I don't know who I am or where I come from. And I may develop a lot of behaviors to keep you away from this kind of fragile interior I may have, because I don't want more loss and more pain. So if we did a losses jar, what are my losses? If we had our parents and family for the child create a losses jar, because that would look different when they were 5 and when they were 8 and when they were 12 and when they were 15, because their losses don't stop when we place them. children's what we call the awakening, kind of wake up to the losses as they age and develop. Age and develop. It's actually where Sharon was talking earlier about there are lifelong issues. So as the child continues to develop, even in adulthood, that their losses continue to add up. The goal is to help them identify and grieve all of the losses that keep surfacing so I can understand me. I need to understand me, or else how do I know what I bring to an intimate relationship? How do I know what my needs are if I don't even know me? So it's a great activity to do. I actually have kids decorate it and write their name on it and put all the things they love, and we have a lot of fun creating it, but then we're writing down those losses really specifically, and we revisit it every 6 months or a year, or when a loss comes up, when a new loss comes up. So for instance, when a child finds out he had a sibling he never knew about, right? Well, that's another loss. So you're writing down, well, I don't know my sibling. There are a lot of secondary losses under that. Well, wow, you lost your relationship with your sibling. You lost all the fun and the birthdays, and you lost so much. There's all these secondary losses underneath those losses. So mastery and control. How do we get to mastery? Many of our kids, and I'll just kind of frame it a little bit like this. If you can look at mastery and control like it's on a continuum, with mastery at one end and control on the other. Because many of our kids and teens and even adults get stuck in control. They're fighting for control from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, to at school, to it with peers, to with their parents. They're just fighting for power and control. Really because they lost all power and control. So we all have this strong need to control our destiny. Remember Sharon showed you that image of the cars driving, that I want to feel like I'm in control of my life, that I have choices to make every day, that I get to have some say-so in the decisions that affect my life and me. And many of our children have lost so much control, they're stuck in powerlessness. So helping them get to this thing called mastery is a process. And some of our parents live with kids that are fighting morning, noon, and night with power and control, creating a lot of power struggles, provoking a lot of power struggles, right? It's really frustrating, those of you that are parents. I'm a parent of 4, like having kids on that dance floor that are fighting for power and control can feel, it's exhausting. By the end of the day, you're like, please, can it just be bedtime? Can it just be time to go to bed? So what do we do? What are those things that can help our children on each stage of development get to this thing called mastery? And for many of our parents, using very simple choices from the moment kids wake up, we call it limited choices. From the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed, where we're sharing some control, so the child is feeling a sense of mastery. Sharing control might sound like this. Within the first 10 minutes of a child's day, I can give them already 5 choices. So did you want mommy to pick out your clothes or you to pick out your clothes? Did you want to wear the red shoes or the blue shoes today? Did you want you to brush your teeth or mommy to brush your teeth today? Did you want help getting dressed, or you're a big boy, you can do it on your own today? I'm going to be using limited choices a lot, because I have to share the control with my child. When I say things like, you need to do this, it's time to get up, brush your teeth, go do this, more traditional or kind of authoritative parenting or authoritarian parenting, that can feel like we're again trying to take power away from our kids. And this is a massive trigger for many of our kids who already feel powerless, helpless most of the day. So learning to give kids some choices, and that children on every step will be making mistakes, and that mistakes are okay. We want to give the message and send the message to parents that making mistakes is really okay. You're going to make 27 mistakes every day, and mom's going to be making 8. Meaning I get to make mistakes too. And that was when mistakes are made, we do redos. When kids make a mistake, we're going to do a redo. They get to practice doing it the right way. Maybe they're practicing that 3 times. And mom gets a redo too. Hey, I didn't like how I just yelled and screamed 5 minutes ago. Can we try that again? I'm feeling a little calmer and I have a better idea. So we're modeling making mistakes to get to mastery. Mastery does not mean that we don't make mistakes. Mastery is the acceptance of the mistakes, that we learn from mistakes. We forgive ourselves when we make mistakes. And we do a redo so real learning can happen within our limbic structures. Remember, limbic structures are deep brain-based systems. It takes practice, sensory practice, to redo those. It's why if your child's playing soccer, a good coach isn't going to talk about soccer. A good coach is going to get out there and let them practice dribbling and practice shooting and practice. So in closing, how does the child heal? This is why for us professionals, supporting our families in the attachment caregiving system is critical. Children heal, change, and grow within and through the context of healing relationships. It is the relationship, the permanency relationship. When they're planted in permanency, we get to maximize all those areas of development. When they're not planted in permanency, remember the child's treading water. So when we're moving and moving and moving children, they're still stuck in survival mode. They're just anticipating more loss, more grief, more suffering. They're not rooted. Their needs aren't claimed. Remember attachment, that primary loss? So for all of our constellation members that have lived experience, think about our children, our teens, our adult adoptees, and our birth first parents, that when you do something for me, without me, you're doing something to me. That we want to be making sure we're including those voices, that we're really allowing them to be the teachers of their own grief, of their own loss, that we're allowing them to frame the experience, that we're really partners with them in this experience of being the helpers, especially if we're outside of that lived experience. So I'm going to leave this up and then open it up to questions. Again, I hope we framed, and you can probably tell that Sharon and I could spend a full day just on this, a lot more time just on this, but we're going to really open it up to other questions to help hear what, how we can help any of this be more useful for our professionals and our parents who are with us today.
Michaela and Cindy, I've referred people back to you who want to know how they can watch this again. When will it be online, etc. So I just want you to know that that's a question that's come up throughout the chat.
Yeah, so after this, after we end, we're gonna send out an email with a sign-in sheet. And then once everyone's filled out the sign-in sheet, we'll respond with the handouts that you sent as well as the recording.
Thank you. Questions?
Questions, and I apologize for having to move so quickly, but I feel good about at least getting to most of it.
We thank you too. Nice, thank you.
I wish we had all day. If you have questions, you're welcome to type it in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself. Just know that we are recording, so you'll be recorded if you unmute.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hi there.
What if you didn't receive a handout, but we do have the class?
Does it come with the email?
So the handout will actually come after you fill out the sign-in sheet. So once you're done with that, then we'll send the recording with the handout.
Okay, so you're gonna sign it. You're gonna send us email us a sign-in sheet, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Wait, that was an easy question, but an important one. Thanks.
Well, you know, your message today was very helpful because we have an 8-year-old, and you know, a lot of things were, you know, I can relate to him. You know.
Yes, good.
Yeah. So thanks.
You're so welcome.
Can this apply to former? I'm trying to stay on top of the questions. They're coming in so fast, I can't. Let's see. I have a question about developmental trauma disorder. I think a lot of our kids are misdiagnosed with other disorders when really the issue is developmental trauma disorder. Boy, do we agree with you. Is this going to, God, I can't pull it up correctly.
Sharon, it says, is this going to be a universal diagnosis soon?
Oh, great question. Well, we've been trying for a long time to get it into the DSM, to no avail.
Yeah.
But there'll be an effort to keep trying.
Yeah, and those folks that want to learn a little bit more even about that diagnostic category and the process and kind of why it failed getting into the DSM, which is actually a pretty political and kind of funding issue connected to who's on certain committees, etc. Bessel van der Kolk's book called The Body Keeps the Score, because he really was the originator of developmental trauma disorder, and he writes extensively about that. So really encourage, especially those of us that are professionals, so we're not falling into this diagnostic quagmire of misdiagnosis, because even the DSM sets us up to misdiagnose our children with things like ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder without really comprehending the impact of attachment and developmental trauma and really helping us to frame what's really happening with our children the correct way. And if we can't diagnose correctly, how do we do treatment correctly? So that book in particular is really super helpful. And I think we do have a long way to go because the new DSM just came out a few years ago.
I want to say that for those of you who wonder why you would attend the next session on the Birth First family, I want you to remember that they're a crucial part of the constellation. And even if you don't work with them, or even if you're not in an open relationship, you do need to understand their impact on your family and how they're working through the core issues in the community that eventually could come back and impact your family and your child. So I do encourage you to see that as relevant.
Yes.
Would you suggest that social workers and/or families ask the children's therapist to include, I can't track it fast enough, Michaela, can you tell me what that said?
Would you suggest that social workers and/or families ask the children's therapist to include ambiguous loss in treatment?
Yes, all losses.
Yes. Yes.
Secondary, ambiguous, and explain it at the child's level of development of understanding, but I think it's real important. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and Michaela, for the person that put that in there, so many of the losses in adoption and permanency are ambiguous. In fact, many of the messages our kids get from the outside world, which could include teachers or neighbors or anyone, is how lucky they are. You're so lucky to have this family or to get adopted, or this undermining of the like, and our children get that message all the time where they're like, oh, I'm supposed to feel lucky. And it can shut down their experience of their losses right away. Like, I don't feel very lucky to have lost all that I've lost. So these myths and stereotypes, it's actually why I'm packing all of the ambiguous losses. How do I grieve my first mother, Jenny, who I don't see her anymore? Where's the ritual? Where's the ceremony that helps me kind of honor who she was or understand, have a picture, see her name, Mother's Day, like all of these things that come up feel really ambiguous for our children.
Allison, somebody asked you to recommend a book on self-esteem and these issues for adolescents. Is there something you particularly love?
Yeah, I feel like, gosh, I'm looking at all of my books. One of the things I do a lot with my teens right now, it's not necessarily kind of connected to just self-esteem in that traditional sense, but there's a hero's journey workbook that really help our teens kind of reclaim their path. Like, this path belongs to me. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the hero's journey, but it's about, you know, it's my job to become the hero of my own story, my own journey, and reclaim my story and my journey. It's mine, it's not yours, gosh darn it. But they often feel like so much has been taken from them. So there's a wonderful workbook. In fact, let me grab it really quick because it's a little hard to find, but I'm using it all the time because it's fabulous for teenagers that really do need to feel empowered to claim their path, claim their story, claim their journey, and they need their grown-ups to support that claiming, which for parents can sometimes feel like they're pushing away from us, like they're pushing away from our values as they're trying to individuate and become their own person. So let me grab that workbook. It's right behind me.
While you're grabbing, Allison, I don't know, can you hear me? No. While you're grabbing, a therapist has asked about a book for a child who grew up in foster care. From, do you have any suggestions for that? I mean, do they know about Foster Strong? Maybe you ought to introduce Foster Strong.
That's a really good, yes. So one of the things, Sharon mentioned it earlier, that, I was the consultant on the movie Instant Family. Those of you that have seen it, if you haven't seen it, that's a great tool. Please watch it with your kids. And by the way, when you're using a movie, talk about the movie, talk about the characters and the Lizzie character and the Thanksgiving table and the stereotypes, and talk about the movie. That's much easier and safer for kids than saying, tell me about your feelings. Many of our kids, that's that's too close to home, but they can easily project into the movie, right? So the writer, Sean Anders of Instant Family, him and I, when we were kind of traveling all across the nation doing all the pre-screenings, we met so many youth from foster care who love the Lizzie character. Those of you that have seen the movie, like, it was such an interesting thing because we met so many youth that said, thank you for making her so strong. She was strong. She was a good parent to her siblings. Like, she was so protective. Like, we wanted to blow up a lot of the stereotypes around what the average person out there thinks about our kids in care. So we wanted you to see her resilience and her strength and all of that. And through those experiences, we met 10 amazing youth that have lived experience and created a nonprofit called Foster Strong. And I'll put the link in the chat in a second, but Foster Strong is an organization led by youth, for youth, that are reclaiming that narrative from a youth-led perspective. They want to kind of blow up the stereotypes in foster care so we hear the voices of more Lizzies out there, because our kids, like Sharon was saying, need more role models. They need to see other folks with lived experience, and their resilience. So we did a whole series, or they did a whole series of podcasts that are unbelievable. In fact, they're starting their second series of podcasts, and they have a great website. In fact, I'll take a breath and put the website so you can all find it.
I'm putting it in for you right now.
Yes, because it's urfosterstrong.org, the letter U, the letter R. And it's a great, the podcasts are unbelievable. And this is all lived youth. They're leading the organization, they're running the organization across the nation. We're really using it as a platform to help empower youth to be able to relate to other folks like them, see themselves mirrored and reflected through other youth that are, living their best life. And we have a whole kind of myriad of variation of youth in that platform. So it's really terrific.
I think we've covered it, Allison, and I certainly want to thank Allison. She did a great job always. And I really want to thank again, Michaela and Cindy. And I want to say what a wonderful, wonderful group you've been. You were constantly chatting and responding and adding your own insights. And we so look forward to seeing you again for session 2.